Hello, my name is Awaiting Dawn, and welcome to the second episode of our series where we pretend people care about how our songs are made and break down a track from its inspiration to its execution. This episode, we're talking about my first song with vocals, 1,000 Twinkling Lights. And this one's different, so we're going to be covering different aspects of writing than in the first analysis. Now, this song started with the piano part that is just coming up now. It's this chorus part. It just came to my mind, and then this song began. The distinct kind of aspect of it is this interplay between the bass and the upper chord voicing here. And that was the main thing that I had imagined first, is one, this bass line, and two, this rhythmic interplay where there's a syncopation right here, where there's a rhythmic interplay between the left and right hands. It's satisfying to play, and it's interesting to listen to when you have that sort of interesting rhythmic aspect to it. What you'll notice is that the upper chord voicings are all very similar. Now, this could be a bad thing, where it could kind of make it samey, where you have, like these two notes are playing basically the whole time, so is this one. But that's generally what I find interesting on piano when I'm just improvising something on piano, is I like to recontextualize chords with bass, where this, if you take this upper voicing right here, I guess it's an F, sus2, or sus2 adds 6. So you could say that. But then it's over E flat, which makes it a kind of interesting chord. So it's like a 7, it's, let's see, it's got the 6 in there, it's also got the 2 and the 3 here. So it's basically got all sorts of notes, and it makes it into an interesting voicing, because I've voiced it as, here's an upper chord here and here's the bass here. And what I like about this style of piano writing, this where the upper chord is stationary, is you get to recontextualize the upper chords with the bass, where this chord is a very similar chord. I just moved that note up, but with a different bass note, it becomes a interesting different chord here. And basically what I do is I subtly change the upper chord with some note changes that suit the bass line, but I basically let the bass line recontextualize the upper part, which you'll notice it in my other stuff that I write on piano. I always tend to do that, where I'll take a melodic line, just like in the verse, where this arpeggio here is the basis for the verse, but I change the bass note and keep the rest of the arpeggio, so it becomes a different chord. But you'll notice I do that with a lot of my piano stuff, where I'll take a repetitive upper part and change the bass note to recontextualize it. And that can lead to a kind of samey feel if you go too far and don't change very much, but it can also have an interesting sound to it, and I think it's pretty satisfying. So basically, I wrote this song on piano before I wrote anything else in terms of arrangement. I came up with the chorus first, then the verse. But one of the more interesting parts that you'll notice about this song is this pre-chorus section that's not only before the chorus, but also before the verse and before the bridge, where it's kind of like an interlude And there's two different versions. This is the pre-chorus version. And then there's the post-chorus version. And what I like about this section is because it adds tension. You'll notice this is basically like a sus4 chord, more or less. But whenever you move the bass note up here, it gets a lot more tense, because you'll notice that is a tritone interval with an octave leap here, these two notes. So it becomes a very interesting chord here, which sounds beautiful but still tense. And so I wanted to get some of that because I needed some variety in the song to the tonality, because the verse is pretty happy, the chorus is still pretty happy, and I like how this tension kind of builds up tension here for it to be resolved in the following section. And so I think it works really well in its place where it's in between different sections. Now you'll notice I said I wrote this all out on piano before I made anything else. And for that reason, I want to talk about the structure versus instrumentation and other arrangement when it comes to making your song interesting. Because basically, if you look at the basic parts, this song is pretty samey. You have verse, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus, and then verse, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus, bridge, chorus, ending. You know, if it was just piano, I would consider it very samey, because once you get past the second verse, there's not too much new in terms of arrangement, which is why I always like to be adding something or changing something between repetitions of each section, where there's always a balance in music between repetition and variety. And you don't want too much repetition, because otherwise it gets boring, but you don't want too much variety, or else it gets confusing or overwhelming to the ear. So I like to find that balance by making everything that repeats slightly different or new, so that there is repetition. There is repetition, but it has variety within the repetition. So that's why I have this second verse here, which has a lot more instrumental layers. You notice I have this guitar, which is just like really simple chords. But I also like to build this up here. You'll notice the iconic sort of build up here, which I think is really the turning point in the song, where you can tell it's going to get more interesting, because it's not sticking around with the just the basic piano. Now, I'd like to take a moment to demonstrate what double tracking does to a guitar track, because it is just super important. This is why you see I'll double track both the rhythm guitar and all these guitar layers. It's just listen to the difference. This is centered. And that's with both of them. And you'll see it just has a completely different sound to it, even though it's literally just layering basically a duplicate track and then panning them. It just sounds a lot more full whenever you have it sound wide like that. So I just wanted to mention that, because that's a really good production technique, and you can apply this to other instruments other than guitar. And this is a good way to segue into my vocal production, because it has a lot of that. You'll notice there's about 4 extra layered tracks for the main vocal, which I did a very similar thing to the guitar with these background vocals, where these are pretty quiet layers, but there's 4 of them, and they're loud enough to where it affects the sound of the main vocal. See if you can spot the difference here. When we didn't know all the things where you see the extra layers just makes the vocal a lot more full sounding, along with the reverb that I have on it. But first, before we get into the depth of the vocal production, I want to talk about the lyrics a little bit, because I was pretty inspired by, of course, the Christmas time kind of feeling and that whole Christmas collection that we're once again doing. I think it was the 3rd annual Whack Christmas kind of collection, and I wanted to make something for that. But this idea that came to mind months ago and inspired the main lyric, 1,000 Twinkling Lights, because I was thinking about family and basically the feeling of not only like driving at night and seeing lights rushing past you, 1,000 twinkling lights, but the connection between that feeling, the feeling of wandering, and then the feeling of kind of coming together with family. And that's all associated with Christmas time and winter time in general to me. So I wanted to do that with the lyrics and focus on that in the lyrics. I think I'm not super confident in my lyric writing in terms of avoiding cliche, because I felt like this song was cheesy to a degree, but I kind of like it that way, where it's a topic that's just, it's a wholesome kind of focus where we're talking about family and reuniting. So I basically leaned into that instead of trying to make it sound less cheesy than it is, I think. Even the bridge lyric, gets into more like fancy, a star's guiding me kind of thing. Not only is that a reference to the birth of Jesus, but it's also just a kind of symbol of the idea that family's united by something, that you can't really explain, where it's just like, well, we're family, So I wanted to express that in a different way during the bridge. But that's basically the focus of all the lyrics in the song. But I didn't think the lyrics were particularly deep, even if they were meaningful. So I don't want to spend too long on them. What I am going to talk about is the rest of the vocal production. Now, layering, I don't know how many other vocalists in our sphere do this kind of layering thing, but it's something that I just found a while ago when I was experimenting with vocals, that it just makes it a lot more, it makes it a lot more full, as I demonstrated earlier. Now, maybe 4 background tracks is a bit too much. You could do 2. That's what I do for harmonies. I also do 2 background parts for the harmonies. But I like the sound of having these background. I think it just makes everything a lot more full in a way that you can almost not notice, but you notice when it's gone, as I demonstrated a bit earlier. Now you'll notice it's kind of cut up a little bit, like there's some gaps here. That's because it's really important to sync up your syllables whenever you're doing these backing tracks here, because if you're not careful, you'll have consonants that will stick out, and you'll hear a messy kind of consonant sound, because you have not only the main vocal is hitting that consonant, but also you have 4 other vocals that are trying to hit that at the exact same point, and you can never really get that at the same point. That's why you'll see that this is a bit trimmed, where that's an S sound right there. Or, what is that? Yeah, that's an S sound there. And you'll notice that I've faded the backing tracks in after the S, just so that that's more crisp, because the main vocal is the only one singing that. while the backing vocal comes in for the body of the note, basically. And you'll notice I do that here. And I basically did that with all these, where not only do you have to sync these syllables so that they're not too far from the main vocal, but you also have to be sure that there's no consonants that stick out in the backing parts of the layer, because otherwise it'll sound kind of messy, and it can take away from the effect you're going for. Now, in basic vocal production, you'll notice I do use auto-tune. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm just not good enough of a singer to just go completely without auto-tune. And there's nothing wrong with having some of it on. But I have this EQ. It's always good to be able to know how to EQ your own voice or the voices of others. I'll talk about this later when I'm talking about Upwards EP, where I EQ'd guest vocals. But you have to know how to EQ your voice. It's generally, I tend to boost highs and cut lows, but in the other groups, these other EQs that are also all on the vocals, there's frequencies that you'll notice in your voice that you'll need to cut out. Like this here, this area here always seems to have trouble with me, where I have a few like high buzzy frequencies that are, up here, and I need to cut them out. And that will make a surprising difference in your vocals, where if you find a frequency that is way louder than it needs to be, and then cut it down, then you can surprisingly turn up your vocal a lot louder than you would normally. Like, you'll notice that with a lot of things. EQ tends to maximize clearness and volume, where if you find something that is loud without benefiting the sound, or actively harms the sound, like some of these frequencies being very loud but not really helping the sound, if you can cut them out, then you'll find that you instinctively can turn it up to a volume where now it's at a good balance, where the reason why a bad EQ can cause a bad balance is because whenever nothing's EQ'd right, then you have frequencies sticking out, which mean that you have to kind of turn down parts overall. And so you end up with a bunch of parts that are turned down because there's frequencies that stick out too much for them to be turned up. But these frequencies and the fact that they're all turned down can just make it a complete mess. And that's why EQ is super important. And vocals are no different when it comes to EQ, because you need them to be clear and cut out. And I noticed that whenever I was tweaking with this EQ is you can cut a few frequencies and then boost your vocal volume a lot once you've found the frequencies that aren't benefiting your vocal tone. I also just have a little bit of compression, and you'll notice this saturator, it's just a little distortion. I always like to add that because it adds a little bit of tone to the vocal. Like, it's not really that noticeable, but it does add a little bit of a distortion effect in the later verse and chorus parts. Now, let me show you the importance of Reverb Sends. You'll see these down here. Those are all my sends, where these here are the indicators of how much I'm sending. So I just send from the vocal bus to these vocal reverbs.
Remember when we used to.
Now, let me show you just the difference. So that's without any vocal reverb. And it's very dry, you'll notice.
It was a simpler time.
And without the background voices, it's even more thin. Like, that doesn't sound so bad when it's just basically solo piano and voice, but when it gets into the louder portions, you really need to have some of these layers in order for it to feel more full and compete along with some of the other instruments here. But mainly, the reverb just really helps the gaps between the vocals here, so that it's not too jarring. And the best thing to do for that, if you want to have more reverb, but you don't want your vocals to get drowned, is to have a sidechain here, like this. Where basically what I did is, I have this reverb here, but I have the sidechain which turns down the reverb whenever the vocal is singing here. So what basically happens is the reverb gets turned up as soon as I stop singing here. So it fills in the gaps and it doesn't make the main vocal any more washy or feel too wet, basically, whenever it's singing, because it's actually, the reverb is lower whenever it's singing and then is higher when it's not. So it helps strike that balance, where I like a lot of reverb, but if you have too much reverb, then everything kind of sounds washed out. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about harmonies, just because I love doing harmonies. That's always a good thing to add if you're going to be adding to a second time through a section, like this verse 2.
It's always been this time of year, with howling wind and falling snow.
With this verse 2 is really where the song picks up, where I was at first going to do a very similar thing to verse 1, where it's not so different. But then I thought of this line right here, where now the vocals take a turn. Not only is the harmony here, but the vocal follows a different line as well. And then with this build-up, there's a third harmony here, which makes a really nice chord. So, yeah, that was something that really lended itself to this section, where now we're turning around from solo vocals to now we have 3 harmonies going at once, and I just love this little bit.
I pray to turn back time,
mainly because that's a really nice chord, and because it's a callback to this pre-chorus, which had a completely different feel, this other pre-chorus, where this is just kind of even a little somber, where it's like, oh, well, you kind of miss the past, almost. Whereas this is very uplifting and powerful as it accompanies the guitar to go into the chorus. You notice again in the second chorus, there's another harmony in here, which I think really helps, because I love the harmonies layering together. It just adds a lot of depth to the vocal here. And one thing I want to point out about the writing, lyric-wise and music-wise, is how this works together in the bridge, where this pre-chorus that I basically came up with as a tension in between sections that are overwhelmingly, happy sounding. This vocal line just really works super well with the ideas that I kind of had together with the instruments, where this is kind of a tension where it cuts out from the really loud chorus with just a kind of somber-ish piano part here, which works really well with the vocal line.
Think the city's fog has finally consumed the stars.
Now, I like how this line works on an artistic and lyrical standpoint, where it's not only summoning imagery of, well, fog consuming the stars, and it's referencing a real-life phenomenon where if you're in the city, of course, you have the stars are basically blocked out by light pollution. But in continuing with the theme of family, you can also connect that to the fact that, everyone going about their lives can, in a sense, block out connection to community and things like that. And I thought that was an interesting thing to have in there, in this thematic kind of callback in this section. And then, of course, this whole thing sets up the perfect punch into the bridge, which is my favorite section. Well, actually, it's my second favorite beyond the second verse because I just love this build-up, but it's definitely a favorite section. Now, this is my favorite section, not least because the piano part is really great. I don't know if you noticed it. Now, this piano part was really hard to play. Actually, I want to give a disclaimer that I didn't play it exactly this perfectly. There is a really easy way to quantize notes in Ableton, where I played the part well enough, and then you can actually select the notes and then move them closer to the grid. So I did that a little bit so that it wasn't as messy, because I couldn't get it spot on, but I got it close enough where these aren't like MIDI program notes. I did play this, but I just moved the notes a little bit closer sometimes in order to make sure that the quality was up there. But you'll also notice I added this this delay. It's actually pretty heavy-handed delay, like you'll notice, because this part really gives a sonic imagery of sparkling kind of lights, which is kind of a visual image of this song. So I really wanted to keep that where you have this delay where the piano is kind of panned a little bit right, and then it has delay in the left that's off, and so you get this kind of sparkling back and forth with the delay that I think adds a lot to the section generally. And this is also one of the only sections I want to talk about the drums on. Mainly, it's just a little thing I found interesting, where this drum part is very basic. It's probably one of the most basic that I've ever put together, where it's literally just, the bass drum is constantly pounding, basically. But I really thought it fit this section, because this section was supposed to be kind of like an outpouring, like an energetic kind of outpouring where everything is going. And I think a groove in the sense where there's rhythmic variation isn't super fitting for that, where this kind of works more together with everything else, just to kind of have a wall of sound kind of feel, where it's like, just listen, where it goes along with everything else to kind of make a whole wall of sound. One thing I must mention is this fill, where it's kind of, it's hard to hear exactly what's going on whenever you're listening to the song, because it's pretty complicated because of that triplet there, where, you're used to, bada 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 bada, that being the fill pace. But then I added that triplet because I don't know, with this section, usually you want a drum fill to be super readable so that you know exactly kind of what's going on. But with this triplet here, I'm kind of violating that rule, where it's, by changing the pace here, I am basically pushing the ear into the downbeat, where now it's just kind of the change of pace is just a change of energy. We're picking up into the downbeat rather than something that you're meant to basically understand the intricacies of whenever you're listening to it. And to help out with that wall of sound idea is these guitar layers, which this is like my favorite kind of type of guitar part to have. When you have a distorted guitar patch, but you're playing, chords high up, I just like the sound of that on a, on an instinctive level. I'm not completely sure, but I just like how that adds to the overall layering of the section here.
Our journeys took us far. We've almost forgotten who we are.
And this brings us to the last chorus, where it's basically a repetition, but I did change the lyrics in the second time through, because I wanted to talk about, like, this line, "I always will return," which is again tying into the theme of family, which kind of is throughout this whole song. So that was a little bit shorter than last time. It's been super long since last time, now that I think of it. I will hopefully try to record more of these in a more timely manner. But until then, I have been Awaiting Dawn, and have a good day.